Welcome to the Bardic tradition, the story of the stories. And before we get going, what I would like to do is just give you a little bit of the theoretical background and thinking behind this particular venture over the next 8 weeks. And the first thing to say is that this is a mythic history that we're doing, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But it's predicated and built on a belief that we as humans are narratively constructed. And what that means is that inside us is an internalized and deeply embedded body of stories. And this body of stories begins before we can even read and write. And it's certainly developed in the stories that we use to learn to read and write. They tend to be the foundation stories of the culture. And they are essentially a compendium of stories typically known by everyone. And I like to call those a mythographic. And a culture as a cultural mythographic. That is the compendium of stories that are how they make sense of the world, how they build meaning, and how they define their identity. So they're an extremely important body of stories. And within that, there is a particular subset of the stories which have to do with the creation of the world. And as we'll learn, Ireland doesn't have a native creation story, but nevertheless, there are some very important stories that do explain where Ireland comes from. By the way, in the sense, they're not creation stories in a typical sense of a creation story, which, like in the Babylonian tradition, it's salt water and fresh water mixing, and in the Nordic Scandinavian tradition, it's fire and ice coming together, and a cow licking the ice, and in the Christian tradition, as we know, it's the God created the world. Ireland doesn't have one of those. But they are particularly important stories because they explain where we came from. And when you know where we came from, you have a good sense of who we are as a people. And when you know who, you get a good handle on why we are the way we are. And Simon Sinek's written and popularized the idea that we need to know the why, but I don't think you really know the why until you know the who and the where. Now, in the Irish case, the particular stories within the cultural mythographic are not well known. But what we found through telling these stories in the Bard over the years is that even though they are not known, when you tell them, the group response is that there's an uncanny familiarity to those stories. It's as if they are known, or at least they are part of a hardwired operating system that is deeply and uncannily understood and known. So there's one other important reason, is that if you do not know these stories, you're a bit like what Marshall McLuhan, talking about matters cultural, described as the fish. And the thing he said about the fish is that there's one thing about which the fish knows nothing, and that is water. And what he was referring to is how the fish is surrounded by water but doesn't know water, meaning that we can be surrounded by our culture's myths, but not be aware of exactly what they are and how they work. And if that is the case, you individually and we collectively are in a situation where you do not know the myths that you live by. And what that means is an important matter, which is that in that case, the myth has you. And that may be positive or it may not be. And so one of the central tasks in this bardic project is to know the myths that we live by. And what we will learn as we move into the mythologies is that the Irish myth tradition is a coming together of certain native stories, which are, it would seem, passed on by generation to generation by a bardic class, the bards and the Fili of ancient Ireland, and they, particularly in relation to the creation stories, are going to be a very important part of this program. And we're particularly interested in the ones in the mythological cycle. We'll learn about that in the second thing I'm going to talk about. But they are myths of a shamanic culture and a goddess culture. And that then was replaced, as we'll learn later on this evening, by a warrior and outlaw culture. And then we have stories of kings. So that is the native tradition. And then side by side is a universal tradition that was, as we'll learn, inserted in the Irish tradition. And that's very much built around the Hebrew Old Testament. And as we know from the Sessa Journey program that we did last year, the Hebrew in turn is strongly influenced by the Babylonian and Assyrian tradition. And what we learned there was that the Babylonian and Assyrian myths were reworked to provide a justification of a long tradition of monotheistic belief, even though it wasn't in the original text. So this idea of embracing and then reworking a mythology is something that has been going on from time immemorial. And it essentially, today it would be called propaganda, but the use of cultural myths for political and cultural purposes has a long history. So at the same time, what we're going to be looking at, and this makes the program quite ambitious and quite demanding, we're going to go through about 3,000–4,000 years of Irish history. We're going to look at a pre-Celtic period. We're going to look at a pre-Christian period, a pre-Viking, a pre-Norman, and a pre-Tudor and Stuart, and indeed a pre-colonial, post-colonial period. And we're going to look at how the stories evolve and change through those various periods. That is going to be exploring the interaction of a body of stories and a mythology and a history. So what is a mythic history? A mythic history, as you're probably working out, is a history based on a belief in the central importance of story, and particularly mythic stories, and particularly cultural myths. And why that is important is that, as we know from latest findings in neuroscience, we feel before we think, and you cannot change feelings with facts, which mean that the understanding of the big emotions are arguably more important than the history I was taught, that had a lot to do with facts, and often stories typically told from the perspective of the winners in a battle. So this mythic history is a history based on a look at the big emotions, and the big emotions that are shaped by the big myths. So in some ways it is in the territory of the Annales school, which is a school, French school of history that looked at history from the perspective of ordinary people. Now the Annales school is very data-driven, and this is not strongly data-driven. It's more built on emotion, and to a certain extent, we do have to be imaginative. I think Edmund Burke called fantasia, a sort of imagination of the myths or fantasies that were in people's head that shaped their motivations and desires. So from that point of view, we're looking at history from a multi-perspectival perspective. We're also looking at it from a relational perspective, in that we'll be looking at both the Irish and the English histories, because they're like two snakes intertwined around a pole. And what we're particularly looking at is patterns, and how over time certain patterns very much tend to repeat. And unless you know the myths, they will repeat. Sort of cyclical view of history. We are necessarily in a mythic history generalists, and one of the dangers is that we will be feeling that the imposter syndrome, that someone is going to come along and say that you don't know the particular details of that period, which will indeed be the case, but can we approach this with a understanding environment, and that we're in a way co-creating what comes out of this, because you will all know bits of the jigsaw. Clearly, we've looked into it a lot more, so we do know a fair bit, but to a large extent, this is a co-created task, and we're excited about it. And we will be particularly looking at the inclusion, in a way, of the Old Testament, and that's going to be part of today, but it's also going to be very much part of the looking at the idea of chosenness, how that was adopted in the 16th century as part of the shaping of around the time of Henry VIII, of a sort of English mythology of chosenness, yes, and what were the consequences of that, certainly on Ireland and then on the world. So it's going to be the native tradition, particularly the mythological cycle, and the interaction with particularly the universal view of the Old Testament that we're going to be looking at. So for now, into your groups, and let's talk about what it is that brought you to this 8 weeks. Why were you intrigued and inspired? And maybe a little bit, particularly if you're new, about who you are and what drew you to the Bard. So into your small groups for 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll see you back again when we get into the meat of the program. Thank you.